because everybody knows that he will not spend 1 minute in prison or jail from conviction on these charges. It is a civil remedy to protect all of us, to protect the entire country, our children, our Constitution, our future. That's what impeachment, trial, conviction are all about. Julian Bond. See, I knew Julian Bond, so forgive me. Most people say, don't even respond to this stuff. I got to respond to this, okay? Julian Bond was a civil rights activist who decided to go into politics, like the people in this room, like all of us who are in politics. And they tried to keep him out. He was a member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which really launched the voting rights movement in America. There's a great story that Bob Moses tells in his book called Radical Equations about, he was a graduate student in mathematics at Harvard, and he went down to Mississippi. You know why? Because he saw a picture in the New York Times of black civil rights protesters, college students, I think in North Carolina, AT&T, and he saw a picture of them on the cover of the New York Times, and they were sitting in at a lunch counter, and he looked at the picture and he said, they looked the way that I felt. They looked the way that I felt, and he said he had to go down south to Mississippi, and they launched the voting rights movement. That's where the phrase "one person, one vote" comes from. It was not invented by the Supreme Court. They would go door to door to try to register people to vote. But anyway, Julian Bond was part of that movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, nonviolence. It was the end and it was the means, nonviolence. And he ran for the state legislature in Georgia, a path other civil rights activists followed, like our great, late, beloved colleague, John Lewis, who's in our hearts today. And when he got elected, they wanted to try to keep him from being sworn into the Georgia legislature. And so they said, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is taking a position against the Vietnam War. You're a member of SNCC. We're not going to admit you because you took a position against the Vietnam War. And the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, said you cannot prevent someone from swearing an oath to become a member of a legislative body because of a position that they took or a group they were a part of took before they got sworn in. That's the exact opposite of Donald Trump. He got elected to office. He swore an oath to the Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. He served as president for 4 years, right up until the end, when he wanted to exercise his rights under the imaginary January exception, and he incited a violent mob and insurrection to come up here, and we all know what happened. He is being impeached and convicted for violating his oath of office that he took. He's not being prevented from taking his oath in the first place. The First Amendment's on our side. He tried to overturn the will of the people, the voice of the people. He lost that election by more than 7 million votes. Some people don't want to admit it. Counsel for the president could not bring themselves to admit that the election's over. In answer to the question from the distinguished gentleman from Vermont, he refused to answer that. He said it was irrelevant, despite all of the evidence you've heard about the big lie and how that set the stage for his incitement of the insurrectionary violence against us. First Amendment is on our side. We are defending the Bill of Rights. We are defending the constitutional structure. We are defending the separation of powers. We're defending the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House against a president who acted no better than a marauder and a member of that mob by inciting those people to come here. And in many ways, he was worse. He named the date, he named the time, and he brought them here, and now he must pay the price. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin.
Mr. President.
The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. President, the Senate is now ready to vote on the article of impeachment. And after that is done, we will adjourn the court of impeachment.
The clerk will read the article of impeachment.
Article 1, incitement of an insurrection.
Senate will be in order.
The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Further, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits any person who has engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States from holding any office under the United States. In his conduct while President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath, faithfully to execute the office of the President of the United States and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald John Trump engaged in high crimes and misdemeanors by inciting violence against the government of the United States in that, on January 6, 2021, pursuant to the 12th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the House of Representatives, and the Senate met at the United States Capitol for a joint session of Congress to count the votes of the Electoral College. In the months preceding the joint session, President Trump repeatedly issued false statements asserting that the presidential election results were the product of widespread fraud and should not be accepted by the American people or certified by state or federal officials. Shortly before the joint session commenced, President Trump addressed a crowd at the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. There he reiterated false claims that we won this election and we won it by a landslide. He also willfully made statements that in context encouraged and foreseeably resulted in lawless action at the Capitol, such as, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Thus incited by President Trump, members of the crowd he had addressed in an attempt to, among other objectives, interfere with the joint session's solemn constitutional duty to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election, unlawfully breached and vandalized the Capitol, injured and killed law enforcement personnel, menaced members of Congress, the Vice President, and congressional personnel, and engaged in other violent, deadly, destructive, and seditious acts. President Trump's conduct on January 6, 2021, followed his prior efforts to subvert and obstruct the certification of the results of the 2020 presidential election. Those prior efforts included a phone call on January 2, 2021, during which President Trump urged the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, to find enough votes to overturn the Georgia presidential election results and threatened security Raffensperger if he failed to do so. In all this, President Trump gravely endangered the security of the United States and its institutions of government. He threatened the integrity of the democratic system, interfered with the peaceful transition of power, and imperiled a co-equal branch of government. He therefore betrayed his trust as president to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, Donald John Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security, democracy, and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-government and the rule of law. Donald John Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States, and demand that you, the said Donald John Trump, should be put to answer the accusations as set forth in this article, and that such proceedings, examinations, trials, and judgments might be thereupon had as are agreeable to law and justice.
Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place, and they'll vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules of Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution, regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment, provides that, quote, no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present, close quote. The question is on the article of impeachment. Senators, How say you? Is the respondent Donald John Trump guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required, and the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, guilty. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley.
Not guilty.
Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Mr. Haggerty.
Not guilty.
Mr. Haggerty, not guilty. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kelly.
Guilty.
Mr. Kelly, guilty. Mr. Kennedy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King.
Guilty.
Mr. King, Guilty. Ms. Klobuchar? Ms. Klobuchar? Guilty. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford? Not guilty. Mr. Leahy?
Guilty.
Mr. Leahy? Guilty. Mr. Lee?
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee? Not guilty. Mr. Lujan?
Guilty.
Mr. Lujan? Guilty. Ms. Lummis?
Not guilty.
Ms. Lummis? Not guilty. Mr. Manchin?
Guilty.
Mr. Manchin? Guilty. Mr. Markey?
Guilty.
Mr. Markey? Guilty. Mr. Marshall?
Not guilty.
Mr. Marshall? Not guilty. Mr. McConnell?
Not guilty.
Mr. McConnell? Not guilty. Mr. Menendez?
Guilty.
Mr. Menendez? Guilty. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley? Guilty. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran? Not guilty. Ms. Murkowski? Ms. Murkowski? Guilty. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy? Guilty. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray? Guilty. Mr. Ossoff? Mr. Ossoff? Guilty. Mr. Padilla?
Guilty.
Mr. Padilla? Guilty. Mr. Paul?
Not guilty.
Mr. Paul? Not guilty. Mr. Peters?
Guilty.
Mr. Peters? Guilty. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman? Not guilty. Mr. Reed?
Guilty.
Mr. Reed? Guilty. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? Not guilty. Mr. Romney?
Guilty.
Mr. Romney? Guilty. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen? Guilty. Mr. Rounds? Mr. Rounds? Not guilty. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio? Not guilty. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders? Guilty. Mr. Sass? Mr. Sass? Guilty. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz? Guilty. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer? Guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida? Mr. Scott of Florida? Not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen? Guilty. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby? Not guilty. Ms. Sinema? Ms. Sinema? Guilty. Ms. Smith? Ms. Smith? Guilty. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow? Guilty. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan? Not guilty. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester? Guilty. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune? Not guilty. Mr. Tillis? Mr. Tillis? Not guilty. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey? Guilty. Mr. Tuberville? Mr. Tuberville? Not guilty. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen? Guilty. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner? Guilty. Mr. Warnock? Mr. Warnock? Guilty. Ms. Warren? Ms. Warren? Guilty. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse? Guilty. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker? Not guilty. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden? Guilty. Mr. Young? Mr. Young? Not guilty. That's why we have these things. Unless you had a script. are 57, the nays are 43.
Yep. The yeas are 57. The nays are 43. Two-thirds of the senators present not having voted guilty. The Senate judges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, upon one article of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and two-thirds of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charge contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby acquitted of the charge in said article.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, I send an order to the desk.
And the clerk will report.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the article against Donald John Trump, adjourn sine die.
And without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned sine die. And could I have order, please? The presiding officer, the acting sergeant at arms will escort the House managers out of the Senate chamber. And in order.
President. Mr.
Majority
President.
Leader.
Mr. President, can we have order?
The Senate is not in order, and the Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection, is so ordered. Does any senator seek recognition? Senator from New York, Majority Leader.
Mr. President, the case of Donald Trump's second impeachment trial was open. Mr. President, can we have order, please?
The senator is right. The Senate is not in order. Senate will be in order. Senate will be in order. Please take your conversations off the floor.
Thank you, Mr.
Senator
President.
from New York.
The case of Donald Trump's second impeachment trial was open and shut. President Trump told a lie, a big lie, that the election was stolen and that he was the rightful winner. He laid the groundwork for this big lie in the months before the election. He told the big lie on election night, and he repeated the big lie more than 100 times in the weeks afterwards. He summoned his supporters to Washington, assembled them on the ellipse, whipped them into a frenzy, and directed them at the Capitol. And then he watched as the violence unfolded and the Capitol was breached. And his own vice president fled for his life, and President Trump did nothing. None of these facts were up for debate. We saw it, we heard it, we lived it. This was the first presidential impeachment trial in history in which all senators were not only judges and jurors, but witnesses to the constitutional crime that was committed. The former president inspired, directed, and propelled a mob to violently prevent the peaceful transfer of power, subvert the will of the people, and illegally keep that president in power. There is nothing more un-American than that. There is nothing more antithetical to our democracy. There is nothing more insulting to the generations of American patriots who gave their lives to defend our form of government. This was the most egregious violation of the presidential oath of office and a textbook example, a classic example of an impeachable offense worthy of the Constitution's most severe remedy. In response to the incontrovertible fact of Donald Trump's guilt, the Senate was subject to a feeble and sometimes incomprehensible defense of the former president. Unable to dispute the case on the merits, the former president's counsel treated us to partisan vitriol, false equivalence, and outright falsehoods. We heard the roundly debunked jurisdictional argument that the Senate cannot try a former official, a position that would mean that any president could simply resign to avoid accountability for an impeachable offense, a position which in effect would render the Senate powerless to ever enforce the disqualification clause in the Constitution. Essentially, the President's counsel told the Senate that the Constitution was unconstitutional. Thankfully, the Senate took a firm stance, set a firm precedent with a bipartisan vote in favor of our power to try former officials for acts they committed while in office. We heard the preposterous claim that the former president's incitement to violence was protected by the First Amendment. The First Amendment right to free speech protects Americans from jail, not presidents from impeachment. If the president had said during World War II that, quote, Germany should attack the United States on Long Island, we've left it undefended, I suspect Congress would have considered that an impeachable offense. Finally, the defense counsel said that President Trump was not directly responsible for the violence at the Capitol. Quote, his words were merely a metaphor, his directions were merely suggestions, and the violent mob was just a spontaneous demonstration. But wind the clock back and ask yourself, if at any point Donald Trump did not do the things he did, would the attack on the Capitol have happened? There's only one answer to this question. Of course not. If President Trump hadn't told his supporters to march to the Capitol, if he hadn't implored them to come to Washington on January 6th in the first place, if he hadn't repeatedly lied to them that the election was stolen, their country was being taken from them, the attack would not have happened, could not have happened. January 6th would not have happened but for the actions of Donald Trump. Here's what the Republican leader of the Senate said. The mob that perpetrated the, quote, failed insurrection, unquote, was on January 6th was, quote, provoked by President Trump. You want another word for provoke? How about incite? Yet still, the vast majority of the Senate Republican caucus, including the Republican leader, voted to acquit former President Trump, signing their names in the columns of history alongside his name forever. January 6th will live as a day of infamy in the history of the United States of America. The failure to convict Donald Trump will live as a vote of infamy in the history of the United States Senate. 5 years ago, Republican senators lamented what might become of their party if Donald Trump became their presidential nominee and standard-bearer. Just look at what has happened. Look at what Republicans have been forced to defend. Look at what Republicans have chosen to forgive. The former president tried to overturn the results of a legitimate election and provoked an assault on our own government. And well over half the Senate Republican conference decided to condone it. The most despicable act that any president has ever committed, and the majority of Republicans cannot summon the courage or the morality to condemn it. This trial wasn't about choosing country over party, even not that. This was about choosing country over Donald Trump, and 43 Republican members chose Trump. They chose Trump. It should be a weight on their conscience today, and it shall be a weight on their conscience in the future. As sad as that fact is, as condemnable as the decision was, it is still true that the final vote on Donald Trump's conviction was the largest and most bipartisan vote of any presidential impeachment trial in American history. I salute those Republican patriots who did the right thing. It wasn't easy. We know that. Let their votes be a message to the American people. Because, my fellow Americans, if this nation is going to long endure, we as a people cannot sanction the former president's Congress. Because if lying about the results of an election is acceptable, if instigating a mob against the government is considered permissible, if encouraging political violence becomes the norm, it will be open season on our democracy. And everything will be up for grabs by whoever has the biggest clubs, the sharpest spears, the most powerful guns. By not recognizing the heinous crime that Donald Trump committed against the Constitution, Republican senators have not only risked, but potentially invited the same danger that was just visited upon us. So let me say this. Despite the results of the vote on Donald Trump's conviction in the court of impeachment, he deserves to be convicted, and I believe he will be convicted in the court of public opinion. He deserves to be permanently discredited, and I believe he has been discredited in the eyes of the American people and in the judgment of history. Even though Republican senators prevented the Senate from disqualifying Donald Trump for any office of honor, trust, or profit under these United States, there is no question Donald Trump has disqualified himself. I hope, I pray, and I believe that the American people will make sure of that. And if Donald Trump ever stands for public office again, and after everything we have seen this week, I hope, I pray, and I believe that he will meet the unambiguous rejection by the American people. 6 hours after the attack on January 6th, after the carnage and mayhem was shown on every television screen in America, President Trump told his supporters to, quote, "Remember this day forever." I ask the American people to heed his words. Remember that day forever, but not for the reasons the former president intended. Remember the panic in the voices over the radio dispatch, the rhythmic pounding of fists and flags at the chamber doors. Remember the crack of a solitary gunshot. Remember the hateful and racist Confederate flags flying through the halls of our Union. Remember the screams of the bloody officer crushed between the onrushing mob and a doorway to the Capitol, his body trapped in the breach. Remember the 3 Capitol police officers who lost their lives. Remember that those rioters actually succeeded in delaying Congress from certifying the election. Remember how close our democracy came to ruin. My fellow Americans, remember that day, January 6th, forever. The final terrible legacy of the 45th President of the United States and undoubtedly our worst. Let it live on in infamy, a stain on Donald John Trump that can never, never be washed away. Mr. President, on Monday, we'll recognize President's Day. Part of the commemoration in the Senate will be the annual reading of Washington's farewell address. Aside from winning the Revolutionary War, I consider it his greatest contribution to American civil life. And it had nothing to do with the words he spoke, but the example it set. Washington's farewell address established for all time that no one had the right to the office of the presidency, that it belonged to the people.